Okay, in this video, we're going to complete the implementation of the header. As we know, the master panel is not an object that can be executed independently. It's executed whenever a panel that has it as master panel is executed. Also, the panel layout will be rendered inside the content placeholder control of the master panel. In our case, these four panels will be the executables. But every time one of them is invoked, it'll execute the master panel. The master panel will have to know who made it run because this who determines three things: the background image of the header, the title over the image, and the menu option that should be the selected one. For home, we should see this image and title, and the button that should be selected with the green indicator below it is home. For attractions, these should be the image and the title, and the selected button should be attractions. For attraction, something different happens because it's not a menu option. This page will be accessed from this other page, choosing one of the tourist attractions shown in this carousel. Then this panel will receive the tourist attraction identifier by parameter and must access the database to load here the information of that tourist attraction. In addition, at the master panel level, it'll also have to know what that tourist attraction is, because it'll also have to go to the database to bring its photo that it'll show as hero in the header, and its name to show as title, and in the case of the menu, actually, all options should be cleared. The contact panel is the same as the first two, with a fixed image, text, and selected button. In summary, the panel executed each time should be identified to the master panel so that it can take the necessary actions on the three elements of the header that we've just analyzed: background image, title, and selected button. We might think this is solved by passing parameters. That is to say, each panel identifies itself to the master panel in a parameter. But the master panel does not support parameter passing. So what can we do to achieve this communication between objects that cannot pass parameters? A good option is to use global events. The events we're familiar with so far are the events of each object, internal to the object, both triggered by the user and by the system. For example, client start, refresh, load, which are system events, or the events associated with the user interface controls. But these are all local events. They're fired and handled within the object that defines them internally. On the other hand, global events will be valid for all the components of the context of an object that's being executed. In our case, the panel and the master panel are in the same execution context. So, if the panel triggers a global event, the master panel, which is in the same execution context, will be able to listen to it and execute it. The same applies to components, as I'll tell you later. And this is what we need: that the panels trigger an event that's listened to and executed by the master panel, through which they can pass information to the master panel. To this end, all KBs provide within the general module a global events object, valid for all platforms, both web and native. There, below its events node, we can define global events so that they can be shared between objects in the same execution context. For our case, we could define a single event, which when triggered, in our case from the four panels, will send to the listener, in our case the master panel, two parameters. The first one, to identify the object that's triggering it, it'll be home, attractions, attraction, or contact. And the second one will only make sense if the one that's triggering it is attraction, because it's to identify the tourist attraction. If the triggering ones are home, attractions, or contact, the value passed for the second parameter will will not be taken into account by the master panel. The other option is to differentiate two events, one that will be invoked from home, attractions, or contact for identification, and the other that will be triggered only from attraction, sending the attraction ID. Both solutions, a single event versus two distinct ones, have pros and cons. I'm going to choose the second one, with two events, just so you can see that we can add all the global events we want to this global events object. Then, for the home panel, in the client start, I'll fire the update master panel header event, passing the value home as parameter. And the same will be done in the client start of attractions, but passing, of course, attractions as a parameter. And in contact, but now passing contact. In that of attraction, the other event will be fired. It'll be the particular one, update master panel header attraction. And since the attraction panel will receive by parameter the ID of the tourist attraction, which will be sent from here, when the user selects an attraction to see its information, for example, the one with ID 8, this same attraction ID will be sent by parameter to this global event. Then, the master panel will only have to listen to these two events to receive that identification and proceed. In this way, if any of these three panels are running, they will trigger this event. And what does the event have to do? Based on what fired it, this exclamation mark before these texts is to instruct GeneXus that these texts are internal to the application, and if the application is translated to other languages, these texts should not be translated. Well, as I was saying, based on what fired it, it should update the header by loading the two variables, header image and header title, with the values that correspond to that panel that fired it. And for the buttons, it'll have to leave them all cleared except one, the one that corresponds to the panel. What we're writing here are invocations to subroutines, which are portions of code local to the object, which can be isolated to reuse them or to make the code semantics more understandable. Within each of these subroutines, for example, let's look at the home one. The image variable and the title variable will be updated, and the menu will be left with the correct option selected. How do we do the latter? If we name the button controls in this way, remember from the previous video that we had two classes for all the buttons, menu label for the typography, and menu button to make the bottom and top border transparent. We could have joined both into one, but well, we didn't do that. There is a third class to achieve the green indicator below, which was menu button selected. In the previous video, we had left it associated in a static way to the home button. Classes can be assigned to controls both statically through the control property and dynamically, anywhere code is accepted, such as in events. In this way, we could write a deselect all buttons subroutine that, as we can see, assigns the two classes, menu label and menu button, to all the buttons of the menu. Then, in this subroutine from which we start, we would first invoke this other subroutine to leave all the buttons as deselected, and then simply assign to the corresponding button, which in this case is the one named BTN Home, its classes, which are the same as those of the others, plus menu button selected. This is how the Events tab of the master panel will look like in order to correctly implement the header when the master panel is called by the Home, Attractions, or Contact panels. Note that the subroutines for the last two have exactly the same logic that we saw for Home. They load the corresponding image, the title, and clear all the buttons, and then leave only the corresponding one selected. Now we need to implement the correct loading of the header when the caller is attraction. But first, let's take all of this to GeneXus to be on the safe side. Here we have the master panel. Remember that due to a bug in the editor, the buttons were invisible. For the moment, to make them visible again, and to be able to operate with them, let's modify this property which was the one related to the bug. Later, we'll leave it as it should be with the value center. Let's take this opportunity and change the name of the buttons to precede them with btn, so their use will be clearer later in the code. Let's start by making the invocations to the panels in each button. In this way, when the Home button is clicked on, we'll invoke the Home panel. When Attractions is clicked on, we'll invoke the Attractions panel. And when Contact Us is clicked on, we'll invoke the Contact panel. For the moment, we haven't even designed the other panels. Now let's edit the Global Events object. We'll add the Update Master Panel Header event with the variable panel ID of character type. We go to the Home and fire it in Client Start. I'll place it at the beginning of the code to make it clearer. And we do the same in Attractions, changing here for Attractions and in Contact. Now we'll program the global event in the master panel. Let's define the variable panel ID. We don't want it based on the ID domain, but we want it to be of character type. Well, we add the do case command in order to take different actions based on the value of the variable. If it's home, one thing will be done. If it's attractions, another. If it's contact, something else. What will be done if it's home? Invoke this subroutine, which we have to define. We can specify it anywhere in this Events tab, which, as we know, is declarative. The order in which we define the events and the subroutines does not matter. If the value taken by the variable is attractions, we'll call this other subroutine, and if it's contact, this other one. Let's program the first one. To the home image variable, we assign the image that we'd inserted in the KB in the preparation stage, link method. To the title, this one here. Then we invoke the deselect all buttons subroutine that we'll define later. And finally, to the home button, we assign the 3 classes. Now let's specify the deselect all buttons subroutine, in which we assign the first 2 classes to all the buttons of the menu. Similarly, we program the other 2 subroutines. Here the image was called like this, and the text was this. We extracted it from Figma. And the button here is the Attractions button. And for contact, we also make the necessary replacements. When saving, it gives an error. It doesn't understand the name btn contact. We come here, it was called this way. We'll remove this ending, and now it works. This loading of the master panel client start will no longer be necessary, and neither will be this button to call the Attractions panel. We check everything here. It's all right. Let's return the aligned items property of the flex to center and run it. The home page looks perfect. And if we click here, the Attractions page is also perfect, and the contact page too. We go back to home, everything is perfect. At the moment, and this is being modified, so whether this is still the case or not will depend on when you watch this video, every time a panel is executed, its master panel is executed again. regardless if the master panel is the same between panel executions. That is, it's built and destroyed between navigations every time. That's certainly not the most efficient thing in the world, and can lead to flickering issues, for example. To understand all this a little better, I'll tell you how it works right now. When launching the execution of the home panel, for example, the order of execution will be as follows. First, the master panel is built, where all the static properties of the layout controls are assigned. The ones that were indicated in due time in the properties window of each control. They're the ones we usually call design time properties. And next, the client start event is executed. If the client start event has an invocation to a procedure, for example, which must necessarily be resolved in the server or to a data provider, its execution is triggered asynchronously, and the master panel is rendered for the first time with what it has so far. That is to say, it doesn't wait for this proc to end to continue and render only at the end of the event. It's rendered, and then it continues. On the other hand, if inside client start there's no asynchronous invocation, then it's rendered for the first time only when client start ends. In any case, after the first rendering of the master panel, the build of the projected panel in the content placeholder is already started. That is, before the start, refresh, and load events are executed. Either because we're here, or because we're here. Another concurrent execution line opens. In the one we were in, the master panel was already rendered for the first time, and the build of the panel was launched. When the proc ends, the execution of the rest of the client start continues, and if in the proc or here there were changes in the user interface, it's rendered again. Next, the other events of the system are executed. Of course, rendering if they introduce changes in the UI. And if there was no proc or anything asynchronous, then here the master panel had already been rendered and the panel build had been launched. So now the other system events are executed. What happens in the concurrent line? Let's see it in the first case. The user interface of the panel is built based on the properties defined at design time, i.e. the static ones. And the client start event starts running. Again, if it has any asynchronous execution, then at that time the panel is rendered and waits for the asynchronous execution to end. When the asynchronous execution ends, the client start execution continues, and at the end, if necessary, it's rendered again. If there is no asynchronous execution, the panel is rendered for the first time when the client start event ends. Please note, if the client start of the master panel did not end when this one did, then here, there's a waiting time until it does. And only after that, the start and then refresh and then load are executed. In short, the start of the panel doesn't begin until the client start of the master panel has ended. Let's follow this order in detail for our case, paying attention to what happens with the image and the title of the header and the menu buttons. So we start with the master panel, as we were saying, and the static properties are applied first. Then the content of the image and title variables will be empty. They'll have their properties, the properties, for example, of the classes. And the menu will also have all these classes associated with each button. In particular, note that for the Home button, we also have the selected class, which we defined in the previous video. We had left it static because we still hadn't started to implement all this dynamic aspect of changing the screen according to the menu. We will have to remove it, clearly. But for now, I want to leave it so that we can think about why it should be removed. We were saying then, at this point, all the design time properties are taken into account. In particular, the statically defined classes are assigned to our controls. Well, then it'll execute the client start event, which we had commented and nothing happens there. As a consequence of all this, the master panel is rendered with what we have so far. The image and title variables will be empty, and the menu with the home option is selected. Next, the panel itself and its client start event are executed. Then the client start event is going to be executed. And if we look at it, it has not only the invocation to the global event, but also these assignments. At the time, I had my doubts about whether to place the invocation to the global event at the beginning or at the end of the code. The result will be the same, since what will happen is that it'll fire the global event asynchronously, but without blocking the execution. That is to say, it'll not stop and wait for it to end in order to continue with the next command, but it will continue until it ends. As the global event is being listened to by the master panel, which is active on the client in this execution, it'll then execute its code. So, summarizing the status of the execution up to this point, the master panel screen was rendered first, with the empty image and the empty text, but the classes for the menu buttons are applied, so home would be highlighted in the menu. These parts of the home layout were immediately rendered. And in this moment, the do case of the global event is being executed. This event is always a client event. Then, this subroutine is executed here. It now assigns a value to the header image and header title variables. And it overwrites in this other subroutine the classes of all the buttons. So that of BTN home, which had 3 classes, now has 2. But since we're running the home panel, it immediately recovers the same 3 classes. When all this ends, this part of the header is rendered again. In this process, we made 2 renderings of the home button. The first one with the static classes, and the second one when triggering the global event. In the case of home, it's perhaps more subtle, but let's think about what would happen if we were loading the attractions panel and not the home panel. In the first rendering, the home button will be selected. In the second one, when the global event is executed, the home button will be deselected, and the attractions button will be selected instead. This could cause a flickering between the first rendering and the second one. Actually, in this case, it'll be rather insignificant because everything is immediately solved in the client. But to make things right, let's remove the static assignment from the selected class of the home button. In this way, they're all consistent with the default classes, so that when they're overwritten with the same values in the second rendering, there will be no flickering at all. Call me obsessive, but this is bothering me a bit. Why am I telling it again that it has these 2 classes if it's already specified here? We're going to make better use of the plus equals operator, so that to what it had, it adds what follows. Make sure you leave a blank space here, because this is a string concatenation, and otherwise, this will stick to this. I do the same change for the other 2 cases and run. To summarize, when running our panel, we start with its master panel, considering the layout controls according to their static properties. Next, the client start event is executed, which in our case doesn't have any asynchronous command. Actually, it doesn't have anything programmed. So the master panel is rendered with what we have up to this point. The order is given to build the panel and project it in the content placeholder, which will be done in this concurrent execution line. In parallel, in the first one, the start, refresh, and load events are executed, which are empty, so nothing happens. In the panel execution line, when it's built, the static properties of its controls are considered, and the client start event is executed. In this case, we have the firing of a global event, which is listened to by the master panel. So this event is going to be executed concurrently, and the execution of the client start event of the panel will continue, and it will not be stopped by the other one. When it ends, the panel is rendered, and since the client start event of the master panel ended some time ago, actually before launching the build, then it'll follow with the execution of start, refresh, load. In parallel, when the master panel executes the global event, as it modifies the user interface contents, it'll render them. As I already mentioned, we're working so that when navigating between panels with the same master panel, the master panel is not built again, in order to improve the performance and user experience. Now we would have to see what is still pending. How to make the master panel load, in the header, the image and title of the attraction that the attraction panel received as a parameter when it was executed, and that it received it when the user selected a tourist attraction in this grid. We know it'll be from this other global event. So as not to go any further here, we'll do it in the next video. See you in the next video.